Board of Managers, March 11th, 2021. Our first order of business is to take attendance by roll call. Manager Hejmati,
Here.
Manager Loftus,
Here.
Manager Maxwell,
Here.
Manager Miller,
Here.
Manager Olson,
Present.
Manager Sando,
Here.
and Manager White is here. Thank you. The next order of business is the swearing in of Manager Sando and myself. And for that, we'll turn to Mr. Smith.
President White, Manager Sando, if you would raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Sherry Davis White, Steve Sando,
I, Steve Sando,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution
that
that I will support the Constitution
of the United States and the state of Minnesota,
of the United States and the state of Minnesota,
and will faithfully discharge the duties
and will faithfully
and
discharge
faithfully
the duties
discharge the duties
of manager of the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District
as the manager of
Minnehaha Creek Watershed District
the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District
to the best of my judgment and ability.
to the best of my judgment and ability.
Very good. Congratulations.
Thank
And there
you
will
for that.
be forms, oaths for you to sign as well.
Yes.
Congratulations to both.
Are there members of the public here who wish to address the board this evening on a matter not on the agenda? Then we'll move on to approval of the agenda. We're going to add an item 13.1, MCWD Climate Adaptation and Watershed Model Update. With
Move
that
approval.
changes. Thank you, Manager Miller. Is there a second?
Olson, second.
Thank you, Manager Olson. And we will vote on acceptance of the agenda also by roll call. Manager White votes aye. Manager Sando,
I,
Manager Olson,
Aye.
Manager Miller,
Aye.
Manager Maxwell,
Aye.
Manager Loftus,
Aye.
Manager Hejmati.
Aye.
Thank you. Agenda is approved. On our consent agenda this evening, we have approval of the February 25th, 2021 minutes and three resolutions. 2117 is approval of the Watershed Partners and Adopt a Drain Program annual renewal. 2118 is acceptance of tort liability limits on the district's PNC insurance policy renewal. And 2119 is authorization for the Long Lake Creek Subwatershed Watershed Assessment Contract Scope Adjustment and Extension. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Move approval.
Thank you, Manager Miller. Is there a second?
Hejmati, second.
Thank you, Manager Hejmati. Again, voting by roll call. Manager Hejmati,
Aye.
Manager Olson,
Aye.
Manager Miller,
Aye.
Manager Maxwell,
Aye.
Manager Sando,
I,
Manager Loftus,
Aye.
and Manager White votes aye. We have approved the consent agenda. Board update. I have two items for President's report. The first is about our reappointment or appointment and reappointment. And that is, I think that it's really a sign, the strength of the votes that we got is a sign that the county has heard and understands what the watershed is doing. We have a good communication and that they have are happy with the work we do and the way that we do it. So I really see it as kudos for all. The second item I want to mention is that the last two Hennepin County Commissioner meetings have been scheduled. They're on the calendar now. We finished meeting with Commissioner Conley and Commissioner Fernando. We will have met with the Carver County and Hennepin County Commissioners in our annual round of meetings. So that will be something we can report back on later. Manager Loftus, can you report on the Operations and Programs Committee meeting?
Yes, thank you, President White. Tonight we met 2 items of our 3 on our agenda that we made it through. The first one was an update on our responsive model program and opportunities. This is a program that is currently under development, and there are 4 projects that staff wanted to make sure the board was aware of, and this responsive model is still in the pilot program and will continue to be refined. The second item was an update on the program review of our Citizens Advisory Committee that has been ongoing. It will come back to the committee in April with summaries and recommendations of both the board and the Citizens Advisory Committee. And then we'll come to the full board in May. We did not make it to our 3rd item on our agenda, and I believe Madam President will address that by perhaps adding that to our agenda, the climate adaptation, update.
Thank you, Manager Loftus. That will be item 13.1 on the agenda this evening. And then Manager Maxwell, a CAC report.
Yes, we had the meeting of March 3rd. We're going to talk about this later this evening, all on climate change and everything else. So that was a very good meeting, a good turnout. And I think about a day later, like the county's going to start working. They came out with a resolution or something. They're really going to start working more on climate change also.
Thank you. The upcoming meeting and event schedule is printed in the agenda. All again are virtual meetings. So on March 25th and April 8th, there will be committee and board meetings. On April 14th, we'll have a Citizens Advisory Committee meeting with Manager Miller as liaison. And on April 20th, it's the Metro Mod meeting, and Manager Miller is liaison there as well. There will be a memo coming out shortly with the next assignments for the next round of Metro Mod meetings, taking us about 2 years forward, and with some explanation around that as well. So watch for that as an email. I think that it'll come out from Deb Johnson. We'll move to item 11.1, which is permit 21026. Ms. Manlick has a Target Knollwood permit.
Thank you, Manager White. I just wanted to make sure everyone can hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Great. All right, I will share my screen here then. All right, so everyone's seeing the main first slide here, right?
I can see your notes, slide,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, let's see here. Got to figure out then how to change that. There we go. Did that change it?
It did.
All right, perfect. All right, so sorry about that. So good evening, President White, Board of Managers. This evening, permit 21-065 is before you for consideration, as the applicant has requested a variance to the district's rules. The Target Corporation has applied for a district permit for the replacement of Boone Avenue, which is a private road adjacent to the Target store located at 8900 Highway 7 in St. Louis Park. The applicant is proposing to reconstruct Boone Avenue to address maintenance and public safety concerns associated with seasonal flooding that takes place on the road, which is within the 100-year floodplain of Minnehaha Creek. So Target is proposing to raise the grade of Boone Avenue while essentially maintaining the existing alignment of the road. The variance request before you for consideration tonight is to the buffer provision of the wetland protection rule, as the applicant has stated they're unable to meet the required minimum buffer width throughout portions of the project area. So in this presentation, I'll be providing an overview of the project, a summary of applicable rules, which include floodplain alteration, the Wetland Conservation Act, wetland protection, water body crossings and structures, and stormwater management. The erosion control rule would also be triggered through this project, but the City of St. Louis Park maintains rule authority for erosion control. So I'll also be providing an analysis of the variance requests and finally a staff recommendation. So for those not familiar with the site, it is in the lower watershed, specifically the Minnehaha Creek subwatershed. The parcel is located just west of Knollwood Mall, immediately west of Minnehaha Creek, and just northwest of some of the district's projects, including Cottageville Park and 325 Blake Road, as you can see in the red highlighted spots in the lower bottom corner map. So getting a little bit more specific about the site itself, the project area is proposed to take place in the northeast corner of the target parcel. So to zoom in just a little bit more, that is the reconstruction of Boone Avenue, which is the road within the circle on your screen. So the majority of the existing road falls below the 100-year flood elevation of this section of the creek. As you can see on the map on the left, the base flood elevation of this section of the creek is about 902. And as you can see, the contour is essentially across most of the existing road. So in addition to that, parts of the existing road come into contact with the delineated wetland boundary, which you can see in the map on the right. All right, so from this point of the presentation on, I've shifted all the plans slightly to show this orientation, just for clarity and continuity purposes, as this is the orientation that was included in the plans that were submitted to us by the applicant. All right, so in the proposed condition, the applicant is proposing to raise the grade of Boone Avenue, but maintain its existing alignment. And to do that, they're proposing to bring in about 600 cubic yards of fill, which is proposed to be offset by this stormwater pond, which will be hydraulically connected to the creek to provide flood storage as well as stormwater treatment. So moving on to the rule analysis for the rules that apply to this permit. First up, we have floodplain alteration. So the rule is triggered for this project because, as I previously mentioned, the applicant is proposing to bring in about 600 yards of fill to raise the road out of the floodplain. As you can see in the plans on your screen, the green sections show the area of the road that's below the 100-year flood elevation. So that's about 400 linear feet currently below the 100-year flood elevation. And the pink shows all of the areas above. So the district requires compensatory storage at a 1-to-1 ratio for fill within the floodplain, and the applicant is proposing to utilize the proposed stormwater pond for flood storage by connecting that pond to the creek, and that's going to result in 329 cubic yards of flood storage created within the project area. So the submission of an as-built survey is listed as a condition of approval, but as designed, this project meets the floodplain alteration rule. Next up, we have the Wetland Conservation Act. So this application includes requests for both a de minimis exemption and a no loss determination under the WACA. Generally, these approvals are issued at a staff level, but since this application is proposing a variance from the wetland protection rule, the decision has to be made by the Board of Managers. So the proposed wetland impacts are associated with the installation of the pipe that connects the stormwater pond to the creek. So as you can see in the map on your screen, the green sections are the permanent impacts that are proposed under de minimis, and the yellow section is the impacts that are proposed temporary under no loss. So both the permanent and the temporary impacts fall under the allowable thresholds under WACA. So as a result, staff recommend approval of both the de minimis exemption and the no loss determination. Next up, we have the wetland protection rule. The wetland protection rule applies to this project because of the proposed disturbance within the wetland, but also because both the stormwater management and the water body crossings rule are triggered by this project. So as a managed one wetland, the buffer provision would require a 40-foot wetland buffer down gradient of disturbed areas. The applicant is proposing to meet or exceed that width along all but 163 linear feet of the roadway. And so along that 163 feet, little or no buffer can be provided, which is essentially just due to the proximity of the wetland to the existing road. So the applicant has submitted a wetland buffer plan that demonstrates a buffer deficit of about 3,500 square feet. And as a result, a variance to the buffer provision of the rule has been requested by the applicant. The proposed plans do meet all other portions of the wetland protection rule. So if the variance is granted, a buffer maintenance declaration and monumentation plan are listed as conditions of approval. So the water body crossings and structures rule applies to this project because the proposed outlet pipe from the stormwater pond will come into contact with the bank of Minnehaha Creek. The district engineer has confirmed that no negative impacts to the creek are associated with the placement of the outfall. But the recording of a maintenance declaration for the structure is listed as a condition of approval. But as designed, the project meets the district's water body crossings and structures rule. Next up, we have stormwater management. So that rule applies to this project as the project is proposing the redevelopment of a site that is over an acre with less than 40% site disturbance and a reduction in impervious of less than 10%. In its existing condition, there's currently no stormwater treatment provided on Boone Avenue. So per the district's rule, the applicant is only required to incorporate a BMP. The chosen BMP for this project is a wet pond with an infiltration bench, which will treat all of the impervious surface proposed within the project area. The incorporation of a BMP does not have a treatment scope associated to the requirement, but that said, the applicant has proposed to provide volume and phosphorus control in excess of what would be required for the amount of impervious surface that's being created, and they'll be reducing stormwater rates in the 110 and 100-year rain events. So the incorporation of this BMP exceeds the district's requirement for the stormwater management rule. A maintenance declaration would be required for stormwater facilities and is listed as a condition of approval, but as proposed, this project meets the stormwater management rule. Finally, as I mentioned in the wetland protection section of this presentation, the applicant has requested a variance from the wetland buffer width requirement. Due to the alignment of the road and proximity to the wetland, the applicant has stated that they're not able to provide the required buffer width along 163 linear feet of the road. So a public notice was sent out on March 1st to properties within 600 feet of the project to provide details on the project and to note the board will be reviewing the variance request. We received one comment during that time, and it was from a nearby business, Lindsay Knollwood 2 LLC, and they expressed support for the proposed project. So the district's variance and exception rule states that the managers may grant a variance if the applicant is able to demonstrate the following points. So first, that there are special conditions inherent to the property, and as a result, strict compliance to the rule would cause undue hardship. So in their variance request, the applicant cited the existing alignment of Boone Avenue within the Minnehaha Creek floodplain as a special condition of the property. The road has been in place since before current floodplain rules applied. As a result, the applicant has experienced regular flooding on the road, which has caused significant public safety and maintenance concerns. Second, they must show that the hardship was not created by the applicant. So as I referenced in my previous point, the road was constructed prior to the existing floodplain rules being in place. And additionally, while economic hardship alone is not grounds for approval of a variance, the applicant has stated that realigning the road outside of the floodplain would cost an estimated $1.6 million. Third, the applicant must show that granting the variance will not merely serve as a convenience to the applicant. The applicant has shown a willingness to go above and beyond what is required of them in almost all facets of their proposed design. As shown here, the stormwater pond that's been proposed by the applicant will provide rate, volume, and water quality treatment, as well as flood storage that far exceed what is required for the project. So the applicant must also show that there is no feasible and prudent alternative to their proposed design. So there are a few different factors here that kind of limit what an alternative design could be for this project. First, Boone Avenue is a shared road that is owned in part by multiple businesses. Target's proposing to reconstruct only the portion of the road on the property that they own, and realignment of the road would require disturbing portions of the road owned by different businesses. Second, the proposed plans will be reducing the number of parking spaces on site to make room for the proposed stormwater pond. Realignment of the road would require the loss of additional 130 to 150 more spaces, which would result in a total number of spaces that fall short of the City of St. Louis Park's zoning requirements for that property. Finally, the applicant must show that granting the variance will not be contrary to the intent of the rules. So the main purpose, or a main purpose, of the wetland buffer provision is to treat runoff from impervious surfaces prior to it entering a wetland. So to address this loss of treatment, the applicant is proposing to direct runoff from the entire project's impervious surface to the proposed stormwater pond prior to it discharging to the creek and the adjacent wetland. Additionally, the proposed pond will provide volume, rate, and phosphorus control that is well over what is required for the project. So in doing so, the applicant has shown that the proposed pond has been designed to meet the intent of the buffer provision of the rule. So staff recommendation is for the approval of the WACA application for de minimis and no loss. We believe that sufficient evidence has been provided for the board to consider the variance to the buffer provision of the rule and recommend approval of permit 21-065. So the requested board action this evening is the consideration of that WACA application, the consideration of the variance to the buffer provision, and then consideration of approval of permit 21-065. And with that, does anyone have any questions?
I guess Maxwell has one question, maybe to Mr. Smith. Is that findings of fact, we have to list those separately, or is that in the resolution?
I'm sorry, I was muted. Ms. Manlick, would you return to the previous screen so we have those 3 points, the 3 asks? Thank you very much. And before looking to your questions, Manager Maxwell, I would like to begin with asking for a motion to approve the de minimis and no loss application determinations.
Olson, move approval.
Thank you, Manager
Maxwell,
Olson.
second.
Thank you, Manager Maxwell. Your question, Manager Maxwell.
My question was just on the findings of fact. Is that just in the resolution there, or do we have to find some others, state them separately to Mr. Smith?
Yes, Madam President, Manager Maxwell, I apologize. I can't pull the resolution up on my screen for some reason. Typically, the resolution would, in granting the variance, adopt findings as recommended in the staff report. I trust that's what's happening here. For some reason, I
There isn't a resolution, is there? We're just approving a permit.
Right.
Okay, but yeah, we'll just refer to the listed reasons, I think, Manager Maxwell.
For some reason, that the permit report doesn't come up on the website for me, but that would be how we would handle it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions about those 2 items, de minimis and no loss?
Well, I don't have a question. I just have a comment. The whole site, this in Knollwood was a wetland at one time, so it isn't de minimis. That having been said, it was done long before there was concern about wetlands and wildlife, etc. But both Knollwood and Target have indicated in the past an interest in working with us on bigger plans to address and restore the wetlands and runoff treatment, etc. But they both exceeded the requirements, but we were a long ways from what the original scope of the plan was, because various reasons Knollwood Center got sold, and Target has other issues on the site with neighboring properties, etc. But the reason I'm bringing this up is I think we can't lose sight of these chances of doing these bigger projects that once we get exposed to an opportunity, go for it rather than rely on the applicants to come up with solutions. The solutions are far exceed the requirements, which is great, but, I'm going to support this, but I think we missed another opportunity here, probably through no fault of our own, but a combination of events not under our control or the applicants, but.
Thank you, Manager Miller. Are there other questions or observations? Manager
Right.
Olson?
I'd like to make just a comment. I'm very familiar with this area. I'm there probably once a week, minimum. And when the water is high, it's a mess. And it is not a simple solution in a simple area. This is a very complex problem that I think that's the second Target store or the original Target store. It's either one or two.
It's the original. It's the original.
It's the original, so it's historic. Anyhow, it due to the complexity of the area and the large amount of considerations for us to even provide a permit, I just wanted to compliment Aaron on not only an excellent presentation, but detailing every one of those issues and bringing it to a resolution like this. I'm usually not one to get too excited about permits, but in this case, it's a very job well done, and I just wanted to make that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Manager Olson. Other comments from board? Then let's proceed to a vote on this first item. Manager Miller,
Aye.
Manager Olson,
Aye.
Manager White votes aye. Manager Sando,
Aye.
Manager Loftus,
Aye.
Manager Hejmadi,
Aye.
Manager Maxwell.
Aye.
Thank you. Moving next to the variance for the reasons set forth in Ms. Manlick's report that all the requirements of variance have been granted. Is there a motion to approve the variance to Section C of the Wetland Protection Rule?
Move approval.
Thank you, Manager Miller. Is there a second?
Hejmadi, second.
Thank you, Manager Hejmadi. Is there discussion? Then we'll move to a vote. Manager Maxwell,
Aye.
Manager Hejmadi,
Aye.
Manager Loftus,
Aye.
Manager Sando,
Aye.
Manager White votes aye. Manager Olson,
Aye.
Manager Miller,
Aye.
the variance is approved. Now we'll move to consideration of approving the permit 21065 with those subsidiary actions that we've just taken. So is there a motion to approve the permit?
Move approval.
Thank you, Manager Miller. Is there a second?
Hejmadi, second.
Thank you, Manager Hejmadi. Are there any additional points to discuss here? Comments? Then we'll move to a vote on approving the permit. Manager Maxwell,
Aye.
Manager Olson,
Aye.
Manager White votes aye. Manager Loftus,
Aye.
Manager Sando,
Aye.
Manager Miller. I didn't hear.
Miller votes
Manager-
aye.
Thank you, Manager Hejmadi.
Aye.
Thank you. That permit is approved. Thank you very much, Ms. Manlick. We'll look forward to not driving through water when we go there. That'll be great. Next item is 12.1, which is Resolution 2120, authorization to release an RFP for a 6-mile Marsh Prairie Trail and interpretation design. And turn to Ms. Domjancic Lee.
Thank you, President White, managers. Can everyone hear me and see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great. tonight, staff is seeking authorization to release a request for proposals for design of the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie Trail and interpretation. Staff first brought this project to the Policy and Planning Committee meeting on January 28th to gather committee's input and direction as staff was assembling the RFP and also contemplating trail design considerations and interpretive themes for the site. And over the last month, the RFP has been completed, and that has incorporated the guidance from committee and also some very helpful input from a staff team, as well as additional information that we've gathered from some project partners. And I'll share the framework of that RFP here shortly. Just to orient everyone to the site, the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie is located within the 6 Mile Creek Halstead Basin watershed, with 6 Mile Marsh and 6 Mile Creek just to the south of the property, and then Halstead Bay downstream and to the east of the property. Minnetrista City Hall is to the north on County Road 110, and downtown St. Bonifacius is just about a mile to the southwest. The 6 Mile Marsh Prairie, which is highlighted in red here, is within the Parley Mud Management Unit of the watershed and lies just east of the Dakota Rail Trail, which is indicated by the black line in this graphic. The original capital project for the site included the purchase of 210 acres that were formerly 2 farm homesteads belonging to the Halverson and Dimmler families. This aerial photo from 2012 looks northeast toward Halstead Bay with the Dakota Rail Regional Trail on the left, that tree line on the left-hand side of the photo, and then 6 Mile Creek on the right-hand side of the photo. The 3 parcels of the prairie property are in the center of the photo here. The wetlands on the site had been tiled and drained and were being farmed along with most of the upland areas, except for a few pockets of oak woodlands. And when the capital project began in 2012, the intent was to restore this land to native wetlands and prairie cover. And that restoration included breaking tile lines in several low-lying areas, which caused the wetlands to expand to their historic extent. And after 3 years of intensive vegetation management that included seeding and herbicide application, mowing, and prescribed burning, the prairie and wetland vegetation began to establish. And management of this type has been ongoing for the last 8 years, and the site has become an excellent example of a successful restoration. So moving on to the work in front of us now, plans for the original capital project included a concept level design for the future construction of a spur trail that would run from the Dakota Rail Trail, which is along the western property line of the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie property, and then the spur trail would then reach onto the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie property. Some initial planning went into this effort in 2013, but at that time, the district decided not to implement trail construction to allow time for vegetation within the restoration to establish. So since that time, the original budget for trail construction of $125,000 has been carried forward with the goal of future implementation of trail construction. However, recently, as we've reprioritized this work, the budget was reviewed and adjusted for inflation following the lapse in implementation. And as such, the 2020 budget for the trail stood at $175,000, which was projected to be spent in 2020. We did not issue a request for proposals last year, so the 2021 budget remained at $175,000. And then since then, we've reevaluated the opportunities for this property and are now pursuing a more comprehensive approach that would include both development of the trail as well as some additional site interpretation. And to support that approach, in December of 2020, the board approved a 2021 budget amendment, which essentially doubled the project budget to $347,861, which will be used for trail and interpretive element design, trail construction, and also fabrication of the interpretive pieces. This change was born out of the approach for site interpretation that we've taken at the Wasserman Lake Preserve site and the way in which the interpretive elements are really true reflections of the character of the site. And it's become apparent that site interpretation can go well beyond our standard text and graphic signage, and that we've really set a new standard with the implementation of the interpretive program for Wasserman Lake Preserve. We also recognize that the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie is really a one-of-a-kind project, and this large swath of diverse habitat is becoming something really unique in this rapidly developing landscape. These considerations led staff to take a closer look at both trail design and our approach to interpretive elements. And now that we've reached the stage of a well-established restoration, we have a really interesting story to tell about the landscape. We want to invest in the public's engagement within the space, a more fully developed framework for public use, determining the best possible trail alignment, and also creating interpretive elements with a high design standard that is well suited to the site. As staff shared during the January PPC meeting, discussions among staff and early coordination meetings with the City of Minnetrista, Hennepin County Regional Rail Authority, and Three Rivers Park District shaped a number of considerations and decision points that were then brought before committee for input. And several guiding design priorities came from that committee discussion and have been incorporated into the RFP. And those include that the sensitive ecological resources on the site, as well as the site's rustic character, would best support low impact and passive recreational use. Second, that the ideal trail length and alignment would be about a 2 to 3 mile loop, which we could accomplish with the connection to the regional trail. Third, that trail use might initially be rather low, which would then guide interpretive design direction to start small with the option to phase in other interpretive elements at a later time. Fourth, that interpretive elements must engage the public in a meaningful way, be reflective of the unique site, and also meet the high design standard that's been set at Wasserman Lake Preserve while maintaining the rustic character of the site. And lastly, that the opportunity exists to interpret the site within the context of the 6 Mile Creek Halsted Basin watershed as a whole, and also connect the site to other work within the subwatershed. So with those priorities in mind, the RFP was drafted to include a comprehensive overview of the site, including its context within the landscape and project history, including several years of habitat restoration, recent coordination efforts and work completed to date, and also resources that will be made available to the design consultant, guidance that the district has received from both Three Rivers Park District and Hennepin County Regional Rail Authority, some early ideas about trail design, features, and potential trail alignment, some possible interpretive themes, and lastly, the support for the regulatory process and public engagement that is anticipated. The services that the district is expecting from the design consultant include the traditional 30, 60, and 90% design phases, as well as final design development, including presentation of that 60% design phase to the board, and also board approval of the 90% design phase. Technical support through the regulatory process and during expected community engagement to follow. Development of bid documents and specifications, as well as support during the construction bidding period. And lastly, construction oversight that would be a shared responsibility with district staff. The timeline that we hope to follow is shown here. We plan to release the RFP tomorrow, Friday the 12th, and then also an advance notice of the RFP release was sent to our standard list of consultants, and we received replies of interest in the RFP from over a dozen firms. So we expect a really good response for the RFP and are also looking forward to the creativity of these potential respondents. We'll hold an on-site socially distanced informational meeting on March 18th, and then proposals will be due on April 12th. Staff will review the proposals in mid-April and then interview selected design teams on April 26th and 27th. And then at the May 13th Board of Managers meeting, staff will recommend a design contract award, and then project design will occur over the following 10 to 12 weeks. Staff hopes to bid construction in August with fall construction to follow. And then with that, staff is again seeking authorization to release the request for proposals for the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie Trail and interpretive design. I can take any questions.
Thank you very much. Is there a motion to adopt resolution 2110?
Move approval.
Thank you, Manager Miller. I'm sorry, is that the correct number? Is it 2120? I think it's 2120.
Andrew, wait, I guess, I'm sorry. That's correct. It should be 21-020. I apologize.
Slides
No
are-
problem.
Yeah.
Is there a second?
Second, Maxwell.
Manager Maxwell seconds. Are there any questions for Ms. Demiantis-Lee?
Steve Sando, I have a question for Laura. Great presentation. Is the access to the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie Trail only off of the Dakota Rail Trail?
I understand, though, that's correct. When we originally contemplated a spur trail off of the regional trail, There's just one access point that is possible based on elevations that are next to the Dakota Rail Trail. And so the spur trail would come off, excuse me, at that point and lead onto the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie property. And since we've discussed kind of where the trail might be best placed and the appropriate length and location, we would consider possibly a loop trail as opposed to just kind of an out and back trail. But those design details will get worked out once we have a consultant on board. In the last couple of years, I think in 2016, when Halstead Drive, which is on the north side of the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie property, when that was paved by the city of Minnetrista, the city of Minnetrista also added a pull-out parking lot on the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie property, just sort of in that right-of-way area. So that could be used as a sort of a trailhead for users of this spur trail and also the Dakota Rail Trail as well.
So there is a pull-out parking to access the trail. Thank you.
Yes, that's correct. Sure.
Any other questions? That was a spectacular set of photographs. It really showed off. It's a beautiful site, such a nice site. If we're ready, we can proceed to voting. Manager Maxwell?
Aye.
Manager Olson?
Aye.
Manager White votes aye. Manager Loftus?
Aye.
Manager Sando?
Aye.
Manager Miller?
Aye.
Manager Hejmati?
Aye.
Thank you. Resolution is adopted. Appreciate that
Thank you.
presentation. Our last action, or our last item here is the MCWD Climate Adaptation and Watershed Model Update. I've lost track of who's presenting that.
I will start that one off. President White, this is Becky. Thank you, President White. Managers, let me just share my screen. All right. Oops. Okay, so tonight, the purpose for our presentation, I'll be co-presenting with Brian Beck, is twofold. Over the past year, staff has been working with the Citizen Advisory Committee to do some additional initial discovery work to inform the district's approach to climate adaptation. And this work has resulted in what's a high-level framework that begins to define our role and strategy. And we'd like to vet this with the board this evening. And if it seems to be on the right track, we'll continue to refine and build out the detail of that strategy for external communication later this year. And second, the board is already familiar with the work that Brian and his team have been doing to develop tools to enhance our ability to understand and predict the impacts of climate change with our the ResNet, the machine learning, the 2D model. And we're now merging these two efforts and putting that work into the context of this climate adaptation framework. And so tonight, Brian will give an update on the progress to date and next steps in developing those tools. And so I'll start off with reviewing the work to date in this climate adaptation planning process and some of the work that's been developed in coordination with the Citizen Advisory Committee, including a situational assessment, some insights that we've drawn from that, and then the resulting framework. Then I'll turn it over to Brian to review the work to date under what we've defined as phase 1 of understanding and predicting the impacts. And then we'll wrap that up by reviewing the timeline and next steps, some of the feedback that we've heard from the Citizen Advisory Committee, and then take the board's feedback. And so I want to just start by framing the overarching purpose and approach for engaging in this work. We know, of course, that climate change poses a significant threat to our ability to carry out our mission, and changes in precipitation and temperature patterns pose a threat to both natural and built systems and impact the communities that we serve. And so our overarching goal in undertaking this planning effort is to ensure that our watershed remains as resilient as possible to a changing climate so that we can continue to work towards our vision of a balanced urban ecology. And just given the scope and scale of the challenge, all the players involved, the complexity of actually implementing solutions, we want to ensure that we're taking a thoughtful approach and not being reactive to the issues that we're seeing. And so to that end, we've started with a discovery process to inform our strategy and start to define our role. And so over the course of 2020, we've engaged the CAC in a series of discussions around climate change. And the central purpose of that work has been to explore our role and our value proposition within the area of climate change. And the CAC has provided a lot of value through this process in, along the lines that Trevor spoke to earlier in advising staff, vetting work products, and testing the clarity of our messaging. And so we've made pretty good progress to date through this discovery phase by conducting a situational assessment, drawing insights from that work, and then using those insights to define a framework for our strategy that we can continue to build from. And so I'll step through each of those components. So to explore the question of role, we went through a grounding process with the CAC where we first explored the science with a presentation from a state climatologist that highlighted two major trends that we're seeing in our region. First, it's getting wetter with more precipitation, more snow, more frequent and extreme events. It's also getting warmer, particularly at night during the winter and times when it's generally cold. The second piece we explored was the governance framework by reviewing existing plans and defined roles across state, regional, and local governments to ensure that we are fitting into a broader framework and don't overlap or conflict in terms of the role that we're filling. And a few of the things we found from that in looking at plans of our cities across the watershed, in the upper watershed, plans were generally silent on the issue. And in the lower watershed, most of those cities did speak about climate change, but their goals and strategies were primarily focused on mitigation and greenhouse gas reductions. At the county level, Hennepin County is finalizing its climate action plan right now. We just responded to a survey last week with some feedback. And we feel that our strategies closely align and approaches, and that their plan really provides a foundation we can build from. And we think that there's potential for the county to be a really strong partner in our process. James and Tiffany have been having quarterly meetings with the county on some other matters, and we're starting to, we've actually got a meeting tomorrow where we're going to start to talk about this work and have that be sort of an ongoing focus in terms of how we start to align our efforts and partner more strongly on that front. And then another thing we found in reviewing these different plans is that most plans, whether they're at the state, county, watershed level, have policy goals and strategies, but are not necessarily really actionable or measurable, which is where we want to kind of get to ultimately with our process. And we'll talk about that more. Kind of the third piece that we did with the CAC was a SWOT analysis to explore, the pressures that a changing climate will create for the district and how we can also leverage it as strategic opportunity for the benefit of the watershed and its communities. And then we also looked at what existing organizational capacities the district can leverage and which ones we need to further build out and strengthen. And a few of the things we heard from the CAC there is that, some of the different district strengths are really in its partnership approach, our existing relationships and trust capital that we have, our capabilities for understanding the science and communicating it effectively. And then some of the weaknesses are, that we have finite resources, we have limited authority over land use and infrastructure. So those are areas where we're really going to need the cooperation of our partners. And so we used that kind of situational assessment work to generate insights that start to bring the district's role into focus. And these include, first, given our authorities and the limited size of our operations, the district is really best suited to focus its efforts on adaptation rather than mitigation. Second, as a data-driven organization, our planning must be grounded in strong, quantifiable understanding of the issues so that we can establish, measurable goals against which we can evaluate potential solutions. And third, our ability to do that currently is limited, and we must further develop our data analytic capabilities to ensure that our actions and recommendations are scientifically defensible, that they are measurable, actionable, and so building out those capabilities is going to take time and resources. And the board has already kind of started us down that path and made some investments. And some of that work is already underway. And like I said, Brian will talk about that more in a moment. Kind of the fourth insight there is that, from our governance scan, we've seen that kind of climate adaptation across the state is still in relatively early stages and still fairly siloed. So there isn't really an existing cohesive framework that we can just step into, or a roadmap that we can follow. So I think we're all kind of in similar stages of kind of trying to figure out really how to move forward and address this challenge. The fifth point there is that we know that we'll be pressured to solve local drainage issues that are driven by climate change, and we're already seeing many of those in recent years with the very wet years that we've had, whether it's in the Nokomis area with the groundwater issues, or Lake Zumbra, those seem to be popping up more frequently. And so we really need to clearly define our role and strategy if we're going to be able to stay focused and ultimately provide the highest value. The sixth point there is, based on our SWOT analysis, we've found that as a regional entity and with our technical expertise, we are uniquely positioned to provide a systems understanding by working with our partners to understand the water budget and the upstream, downstream cause and effect across our communities. And finally, since we don't have all the authority, we don't have all the resources, we don't own all the infrastructure that we're going to need to adapt to a changing climate, we know that we are going to need to build a coalition of willing partners and work with them to develop a strategy that we can implement together. And so based on these findings and insights, we've developed a draft framework that characterizes our role as falling into 3 buckets. And these 3 roles also represent 3 largely sequential phases of work, with each kind of building on the one before. And so the first is to understand and predict where the district will utilize and expand our capacities in data collection and analysis to understand and predict the impacts of climate change, establish measurable goals, and then evaluate potential solutions against those goals. And so, we view this as a really significant role for the district. And, so at the point we're at now, we can set policy goals, we can set strategies, which is, kind of what we saw in our scan of a lot of what we're seeing from a lot of other plans. But we want to take that to the next level and make sure it's actionable, it's measurable. So, for instance, we could set a goal of increasing storage, and we know we're already doing that through our work, but we don't really know how much or where or what's the best approach to that in terms of the types of projects we might implement or how we might regulate. So then building from that, the next phase then is to communicate, convene, and plan. And as Kate mentioned in her presentation, later this year, we're planning to establish a technical advisory committee. And the initial focus will be on the responsive model and the permitting alignment. But then from there, we plan to begin engaging them in climate adaptation discussions, probably out in 2022. And really just kind of starting to build the understanding, bring them along through the process as we work to build the model, establish goals, evaluate scenarios and strategies, and ultimately work together to build an implementation plan. And so then the third phase is to implement, measure, and adapt, where we will implement our role as defined through this planning effort. And this will likely include project implementation, policy changes, potentially changes in regulation, in coordination with other regulatory entities. And another critical role in this phase will then be measuring progress and practicing adaptive management. And so I think, we've discussed internally, this strategy or this framework seems fairly common sense and obvious, but it does seem to be a fairly unique approach based on what we're seeing in our governance scan. And so at this stage, we have, the most detail on phase one. Naturally, that's where we need to start. And so I'll turn it over to Brian here in a moment to cover kind of the work to date and preview some of the work ahead under that phase. But I'll just pause for any questions as I transition control over to Brian.
No questions?
Becky, this is James. You mentioned that you'd be summarizing next steps towards the end.
Yep, we've got a timeline and
Okay.
next steps after Brian's piece.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I am just gonna kind of move on from where Becky left off, but I'll be focusing exclusively on that understand and predict phase. And I think it's been a project that we've talked about several times with the board, which has been focused on the ResNet real-time sensor network, machine learning for water level forecasting ability, and then also building a two-dimensional watershed model so we can better evaluate our watershed strategy. And so the idea is incorporating that into our climate adaptation strategies so we can use the tools that Research and Monitoring is developing to help adapt to climate change. And so I wanted to just take a moment to explain how these different things work together to help us build out this understand and predict approach. And I want to just label things in the lower left-hand corner for data collection, which is our real-time sensor network, and then any other data collection, our short-term forecasting, which is going to be our machine learning, and our long-term planning tools, which is our two-dimensional model. And so, right now we're in the middle of deploying this real-time sensor network, which I'll go into each one of these tools into a little bit more depth and say what progress we've made and the next steps. But really, this slide is just giving the overview of how they work together. And so using that real-time sensor network to start to build out our ability to do short-term predictions. And the reason why that's so important is so we can start developing high water forecasting capability to, number one, communicate that information out to partners and citizens, but also optimize our operation of Grays Bay Dam. And so this is really a short-term adaptation strategy using infrastructure that we already have and data that we're collecting in the near term. However, we have this other longer-term planning tool that we're developing, which is our high-resolution watershed model. And the goal with that is to develop that ability to understand the impact of climate change and also assess climate change strategies quantitatively, so we know what we're doing has the greatest scientific evidence possible. And that really creates a second bucket of work, which is collecting high resolution landscape data and stormwater infrastructure data to build out that watershed model. And so there's three discrete types of work, which is data collection, short-term prediction, and long-term planning. So just starting with that data collection, which we've talked a lot about, the work that Kaylee Cermak is working on and has put a ton of time into, is developing a high resolution real-time sensor network, which we refer to as ResNet, to be coupled with our partners' sensor networks. So Hennepin County has precipitation gauges, so we understand how much water is falling on the district. We put out water level gauges so we can see how our streams and lakes are responding to increased precip. In 2020, we deployed sites at several locations throughout the district. There was actually a supply chain issue with some of the suppliers due to COVID, so we were only able to put out a smaller subset, but this allowed us to make sure that our system's working, the data is getting pipelined into our database, and so the plan is to deploy all the sensors this year. The other thing that we did in the meantime was develop an interactive web dashboard it was only used by internal staff, but it displayed in real time what water levels are at any of the sites that we had equipment out at. And so we found this tool to be really useful, and some other staff did as well. And so the next step in 2021 is deploy the remainder. So we have all 25 sites out and functional, and have a soft rollout of the web dashboard to partner agencies who can give us feedback so that we can do a full rollout in 2022 as the website update moves forward. And so, that's just one bucket of work that we're working on. So the other piece is that short-term short-term forecasting capability, and that's really leaning on our ability to, collect the precip data, how much is falling on our watershed, and then understand using machine learning what the response in water levels will be to help inform flood forecasting and dam operation. And so in 2020, at the furthest out site, right at the outlet of the watershed, the USGS water level monitoring site, we used Hennepin County's Mesonet precipitation data and the USGS water level data to build out an initial machine learning model. So an example of that is over here. Here's the actual water flow at the USGS site. And what we did was build based on precip data and a few other data sets and that water level response. And that was the red line is the machine learning's initial guess at what flow is. But over time, as you exposed it to more and more data, it got better and better at guessing what the response is. So the value of this is now you can take a forecasted weather forecast for precip, temperature, some other things, and be able to forecast what the future water level will be specifically at that site, but the goal is to deploy this at all the sites that we have outlined. And so the next step for this, for the machine learning model is having a third party review what we've built to make sure that it's meeting industry best practices. And secondly, integrating that machine learning model into that web dashboard so that we can better understand in real time what the water level response is, and that can just be pipelined into a dashboard so people can see that. So that provides an interim climate adaptation tool set for us. However, I think the real value in that we bring is our ability to plan for the future and build these quantitative tools that help us figure out, okay, if we want to spend money, how do we spend it most effectively and with which partners? And so long-term planning, really using this high resolution watershed model, which I'll again explain a little bit more and then help explain what we've done and then next steps, but helping us understand what the impact of climate change will be and help us understand what the most effective strategies will be and moving forward. And so one of the first things that we did in 2020 was pose to the CAC what are some of the questions that they might have for climate change. And they supplied us with a really diverse set of questions that were really good. And we took those, added some of the questions that MCWD staff would have, And we put them into two buckets, which were, and I've kind of given this away already, but you know, what are or will be the impacts of climate change on our watershed? And they had really great questions like, what would be the magnitude of the impact? Where is going to be the greatest impact? How frequent are we going to have flooding issues? And those are things we just don't have answers to right now, because either the model is too coarse, the models that we have are too coarse, or we just don't have the data to support it. And so the other bucket of questions that they had was, what are the strategies to adapt to climate change? Because Becky had listed some really great ones, which are, should we change potentially some of our rules or policy? Will the rules that we have be sufficient, and the projects that we're doing today sufficient to adapt to climate change, or do we have to go above and beyond? And so those are the questions that, using that quantitative model to help answer that, so that we can have a framework that, we really know whether or not our climate plan is going to help us adapt to this, very real threat that is happening. And so the reason why, the two-dimensional watershed model is so useful is, unlike the machine learning model, which doesn't exactly understand why you're getting these water level responses, it incorporates the physical structure of our watershed. It uses soils, topography, wetlands, land cover, storm sewers, and those are all to some degree management levers. Do we do wetland restoration, or do we focus on storm sewers or land use? And using those levers for management, we can start to say, okay, if we have all of that information, we put it into a two-dimensional model, and you can start figuring out what would be the most effective tool set for climate change based on the impact that it's going to cause. So, the location, frequency, and magnitude of issues, and also evaluate what strategies are going to be most effective. And so in 2020, we applied to LCCMR for funding and did not receive funding. So in the meantime, we did take efforts to build our coalition further and find more support, which I'll talk about in a moment. We're developing a backup funding strategy if we don't receive LCCMR funding this round. And also, in the meantime, exploring partnership with the City of Edina to build a pilot model for informing our full watershed model build. And I'll explain how the timing of that would work. So this is really just how the timing of the watershed model build is going to work. So the LCCMR application is in is on the due date is April 2nd, which is coming up soon, and we'll be requesting board authorization on the March 25th board meeting for authorization to apply to that LCCMR fund RFP. If we did receive that funding, the LCCMR grant distribution would be in 2022, July 2022, which gives us about a year to build that pilot model with the City of Edina to really understand what, not only what models we'd be using, but it'd be working with a city that potentially could help us understand what their role versus our role would be in climate change with respect to building out these models and informing our future work. And then lastly, in the background, we're also determining if there are alternative funding opportunities, just in the event that we don't get the grant funding again. So just really quickly, I know I just went over a timeline, but I thought it would be useful to show how these buckets of work fit into not only a timeline, but also fit into our strategy as a whole. So again, we're in the middle of deploying these sensors to help us build a data set. We're building, in the meantime, this machine learning model to help us adapt to climate change today. So that is an interim action, but we're also building that high resolution watershed model. And our original LCCMR application was for $1,300,000 approximately, but we were able to push some of the work through and start and do it, in 2020 and early 2021. And so our 2021 application would be about $250,000 less because we've been able to do some work in the meantime. And after that's all built out, that's when we'll be able to do those impact assessments and then also develop that strategy to make sure that what we're doing is the most effective thing possible. So with that, I can hand it back over to Becky, but yeah, I think we'll be taking questions if anybody has them at the end of the presentation.
Sure, yeah, I'll just cover a timeline and then some of the CAC feedback, and then that's all I have before we can open it up. But yeah, we wanted to kind of show how these different phases map out over time, and some different kind of deliverables along the way. And so in the orange there is kind of the discovery phase that I talked about, over the last year, the work that we've done with the CAC. Then in the yellow is phase 1, which we're kind of starting in earnest now. As Brian described, some of that's been underway, but we're just sort of putting it in the context of this framework now. And as Brian explained, that's going to take a few years to fully build out the pilot and then the full model. But we'll be getting certainly some benefits in the meantime in terms of optimizing the dam and continuing to refine our understanding. And then in the green is the phase 2, and these are all pretty rough timelines with a fair amount of overlap, as you'll see. But as I had mentioned, we're planning to engage the Technical Advisory Committee in climate adaptation discussions, probably sometime mid next year, so that we can start to kind of bring them along through the process, get their input as we develop the model, as we start to establish goals, evaluate scenarios. And so we don't know, exactly what that will look like yet, but we know we want to start that kind of early and bring them along through the process. And then ultimately the goal is to have that planning process completed and have an actual kind of concrete implementation plan in time for our next 10-year plan update in 2027. And so, we recognize this is a long timeline, but we, think it's a realistic one. And we know it's going to take time to develop the model, test the strategies, build consensus and support with our partners before we can actually have a quantifiable, actionable, collaborative plan.
14 points, 3 steals.
Hearing some basketball, I think. And so that's not to say that we won't be taking action until then. As Brian described, we're continuing to optimize the dam. We know we already are doing work to increase storage and reduce rates through our projects, through our rules. It's just that we don't really have the clear targets for what we're trying to meet to manage volume. And so, not only do we want to be taking action in the interim, but we also want to start communicating our approach in the near term, not waiting until this plan and process is complete. And so over the course of this year, we plan to build out this framework into a more robust and refined strategy that the board can ultimately adopt, and we can start to communicate externally by the end of the year, whether that's fact sheets, an amendment to the watershed management plan, or what have you. And so we'll be likely looking to bring on some consulting support later this year to help develop some of those materials and keep that moving along so we can start to be messaging this more effectively to our partners. And so I'll just move on then to, so we provided a similar presentation to the CAC last Wednesday, and they had some good feedback. So I just wanted to summarize that for you before opening it up to get your feedback. And first, we heard that there is general consensus that the approach makes sense, and they're supportive of the approach we're taking. One thing that we did here was that we need to continue to refine our messaging so that it's clear, it's simple, kind of can give our little elevator speech, and also that it's compelling and that it's really resonating with people. So using examples, really making the value clear will be important moving forward. Another thing that we heard is that kind of the report and then the way we've been talking about it focuses primarily on flooding, but we need to make sure we're speaking to the other impacts as well and considering those, whether it's water quality or ecological integrity. So we'll make sure that that is clearly incorporated as well. We'd also heard from a couple members that they'd like to see the strategy include mitigation. And I think, you know, while they recognize and we've discussed that that won't be, we don't see that as the primary focus. I think, you know, there are opportunities for us to explore. So that's something we're taking into consideration as well. And then finally, another thing that we heard was that, you know, the kind of the long timeline for this work could give the perception that we lack urgency. And so we're going to need to make sure we make a strong and compelling case for why this is we think this is the right approach, and that we define kind of the actions we're taking in the interim to, you know, make progress towards the goal, but that we think this longer term approach is where we ultimately need to get to. And so I think that was all helpful feedback that we'll be taking into consideration as we move forward with refining this framework. And so with that, oops. Oh yeah, Brian's got control. I'm trying to advance my screen here. Yeah, we'll just, you know, open it up for any feedback on just, you know, whether the board, you know, if this framework seems clear, is it on the right track? You know, are you comfortable with kind of what we're framing in terms of next steps? You know, like I said, we're kind of, that work is underway for phase 1, and then otherwise we'll be kind of focusing on the communication side and trying to package this into something we can start to communicate externally. So those will be kind of the 2 big next steps if this seems to be on the right track.
Thank you very much. Are there questions from the board?
Yeah, I have some unscientific observations. First of all, I'm really impressed with how comprehensive this approach is, and how we're not duplicating what anybody else is doing, and we're staying in our own lanes. But my question is simple. I've been on my pond behind my house for 40 years, and it's raising. The water level is raising every year. Matter of fact, my yard is eroding. And I know the emphasis is on the creek, but are you looking at all these wetlands? Because a majority of the water, I would suspect, it goes to wetlands and lakes that aren't connected to the creek. Is that going to be some kind of a monitoring system there as well?
Yeah, I can grab this question. Yeah, part of building out the 2-dimensional model is incorporating the, you know, all the wetlands, all the ponds, you know, all the BMPs that are in the area, so you can understand, we can understand, you know, maybe some areas have enough storage to deal with climate change, whereas, you know, some areas have no storage. So just knowing where those are, so going out and collecting that data, that's part of the data collection outside of the water level data collection that we're doing, is going to be critically important. And that's why, you know, part of why it's going to take so long to do is collecting all that information is part of this grant, and putting it into the model so that we can say, you know, what if you add a wetland? What if you add a pond? What if you add an infiltration basin? So it's going to be, you know, really important to collect that data, and it is part of the overall project, so we can figure out how important each, you know, acre foot of storage is in our watershed.
Thank you.
Other managers?
This is Gene, I had the same question the other night at the meeting. You know, Edina and Hennepin County are both kind of getting into a little bit more about how do we get more cities involved or excited about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish.
Sure, Manager Maxwell, managers, that's a good question. I think that's why we want to put, you know, the emphasis in starting to put together sort of the communication side of our approach, so that we can start to make those connections. And some of that is already happening. You know, like I said, with conversations with the county, and I know James has been starting to kind of convey our approach in some of the conversations he's having with city managers and others as well. But we don't kind of have, you know, the fact sheets and you know, kind of the glossy materials to go with that. But I think we do want to start to build that understanding and, you know, starting to gauge where cities are at. Because like I said, they're mainly focused on, you know, kind of the mitigation side and not necessarily thinking about the adaptation side right now. So I think they will be looking to us for leadership and answers on a lot of that. And so, so, you know, we hope to start engaging them more formally through the technical advisory committee as, you know, as soon as next year, so that they are kind of coming along with us and we're building a coalition of support. But because that's going to be really critical and it's going to be a lot of work moving forward. So I don't have, you know, probably more specifics than that, but.
No, I just that we're well aware of that. There's a lot of
Mhm.
cities that aren't even thinking about it, and we just got to get them into the mindset that they got to start looking at it.
Right.
I think to piggyback on Becky's response there, Manager Maxwell, and answer your question, I think you had asked this question at the Citizens Advisory Committee meeting too. Becky had spoke to, in terms of getting communities excited about it, we're currently working what I would call a steady ground game. And so we've got support from every creek community and the park board. We did last time, and we're using this year as an opportunity to update them on progress made and dust off their letters or resolutions of support for LCCMR. So we have all the creek communities. We have support from Mound, Wayzata. We had support from Orono. We'll be going back to those communities. Victoria, we've had strong support from Hennepin County and had some conversations with Carver County, who's willing to provide some support for the grant application. And then above that, we have support from the Department of Natural Resources, USGS. So I think that's the work that we've done, and we're going to keep adding people to that coalition. In terms of how, one way is to just get them excited about the value of the work. And one way to do that is to make it relevant to local projects and local issues. And I think with the toolkit that we're building out, that's not necessarily hard to do. You heard today about Morningside. There's drainage, land use, and infrastructure issues district-wide that communities are dealing with. We hear about a lot of them through the responsive program. You know, identifying how this toolkit's going to help them is one way to get them excited. And then one thing that works is just mentioning the coalition that we've already built. People are usually more willing and apt to join if there's already a good bevy of partners in play, and we've got that going for us too. And then the third piece would be actually bringing all this into a focused package of communications. I think Becky hit it on the money. We need to, in this next phase, have the board, CAC, our staff, all talking about our role and approach on climate adaptation the exact same way in 2 minutes or less. So as we talk to legislators, city councils, engineers, parks directors, water resource professionals, residents, that we can deliver that message crisply, consistently, and with kind of high visual impact. So those would be the three things that I'd say in terms of how we're going to keep building community support.
And just as long as we keep showing our success, I mean, highlight our successes too.
Thank you for your question, Manager Maxwell. Are there other managers who have questions or comments?
Yes, this is
President
Arun.
White. Oh,
Yeah, go ahead. Please, Jessica, go ahead. I'll go next.
are you sure?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay. This is a fairly new topic for me, not climate adaptation overall, but specifically looking at it in a more local lens. I guess some of the priorities that would strike me are, number one, that we have a very clear role. As someone said, we're in our lane. And to me, that means we're looking at things like flooding, capacity, which relates to our dam operations. And then I agree, being able to make predictions is useful, especially if we can share that information with partners. And I heard a little bit discussion of internal web dashboards, but I would ask the question eventually of what kind of external usage could we get from that information eventually? What kind of dashboard would be available to the public, like Dick kind of mentioned, of people's own backyards? You know, eventually, how do we make something useful for the general public as well? We've put a lot of time and money and thought and resources into different programs such as Whiskey and E-Grades, and I just want to make sure we get results from all of the work that's gone into those. And then another big priority for me, and it sounds like you've touched on it, but I just want it to be a priority that we're not duplicating efforts here. I understand Hennepin County and Edina are leading the charge, and I think we should be complementing them, but we certainly are not the experts in this area, and we have some work to do, but it definitely, in my opinion, should be a priority not to duplicate. And then my last comment or priority would be, I'm going to acknowledge I don't know the ins and outs of this, but when we talk about external consultants and adding some more additional data collection in phase 1 for kind of the long-term modeling, it makes me wonder, should the long-term modeling be in phase 1, or is that a phase 2? Does that come later? I don't know the right answer. It's just a question that struck me listening to your presentation for the kind of getting an introduction to this whole topic. So those are my comments. Thank you. No need to respond to each one. I just wanted to get those out there as our first time kind of discussing this.
Manager Hajmati?
I wanted to be sure that, did anybody want to respond to Manager Loftus's comments or questions before I start? Okay, sounds like I can go ahead then. I want to be sure that that was complete. First thing, I want to congratulate everybody who's done work on this. It's really exciting to see this first set of results coming out. I was particularly impressed with the way in which you showed the machine learning model, adhered to the way in which the water actually, the data itself, that is the machine learning model and the data seem to agree. Now, this is just a quick view of it. You know exactly how well it fit and how well it didn't. But the fact that you were able to even show that in such short order is very exciting. That's really wonderful to see that. But I like that you are going to get third-party feedback, so we can be absolutely sure that the work that we are doing is valid, and that other people, academics and so on, can look at it and say, yes, this is reliable and good information. That's excellent, because that'll give us a much stronger base. I really like the fact that we've engaged with partners, and that, I agree with everything that all the other managers have said about increasing the number of partners, working more closely with them and not duplicating efforts and so on. I just want to step a little further back and just congratulate you on having done a good job with that. And also the thinking, the way in which you have thought through how to move forward is really excellent. So I want to congratulate you on this. We're seeing, a lot of this was theoretical up to this point. Now we're beginning to see some results, and I'm very excited. Yeah, I'm very excited to see that. I want to congratulate everyone who has been doing this for such a great job. A couple of comments. I'm assuming that you will use climate change as an incentive, that this will support climate change as an incentive when we look for grant support. The fact that this has become a priority for the state, and we are contributing to that. Therefore, LCCMR should, that's an incentive for them to fund us. I'm presuming that you're doing that. I don't think I have to tell you to do that. The question I had was the Technical Advisory Committee. Who are these folks?
Sure, Manager Hajmati, managers. I think it would be fairly similar to a technical advisory committee that we established for the development of our 10-year plan, which is primarily, technical staff from our cities, as well as, counties, state agencies. And so we, don't have that exactly defined yet, but I think it would be a fairly similar subset to the group we tapped for the plan update. And so that's still, somewhat to be determined, and we need to kind of solicit interest for that. But, we've kind of talked about one thing we'll need to figure out is, I think there's value in having sort of a long-standing committee that, kind of meets on a regular basis and has, we'll have a, kind of a work plan of kind of priority initiatives each year. And like I said, we'll be starting with the responsive model, the permitting, and then transitioning into climate adaptation. And so, as we kind of move to different topics, we'll just have to figure out whether, there's different people that need to get pulled into that, or if it is sort of the same consistent group, because there's obviously some value in consistency, but there may be different different folks or different areas of expertise that we want to tap as we move through different topics too. So that's still something we need to think through a little more.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this is the first time I've, I did not know about how the TAC was set up previously. So thank you for filling that in for me. I'm wondering if those folks can also be folks who can help provide us information with the kind of stuff that kind of material that some of the managers have been talking about, where they would know something about what each of those state or cities are going to be doing around climate change, so that we are not duplicating and we are working in a complementary way. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we're keenly considering as well, is how we do, kind of find the right people to connect with on this, who are kind of the people that are sort of leading on this and can be a good, whether we have some sort of, steering committee or something, kind of more of a core team of, with Hennepin County or Edina or others, so that we're really figuring out how we can kind of use their efforts and build on it, but not duplicate it, and really be sort of leveraging each other's resources. And so I think that's
okay, great.
Yeah.
So you're thinking about it already. Okay, that's all I needed to know. And I was pretty sure that you were already thinking about it. This is an excellent job. I really want to congratulate everybody who's done this. Brian, the ResNet and the models that you have set up are just, I'm very excited to see it, and thank you for doing such a great job.
Thank you, Manager Hajmati.
Other questions? I'll weigh in with one, which is, does this, or how does this interact with rulemaking, with our new rules process?
Sure, Manager White, managers. That's a good question. I think that, I think that we'll start to broach some of these subjects through, our engagement of the Technical Advisory Committee on rule revisions, but I don't think it will necessarily be driving, any changes in rule scope or standards this time around. The focus that we've kind of set for this round is really about, streamlining the rules, improving customer service, really putting our time and energy to, the kind of the highest risk, highest reward permits, developing partnerships, some of those things. And so we haven't been planning on sort of, substantial rule changes in terms of scope and standards. And also we just don't yet have the data to inform what those changes might need to be to kind of move the needle on climate change. So I think those types of changes would be further down the road, but I think we will use the rule revision process and those conversations with the technical advisory committee to start to flag some of those issues and what might be, kind of coming down the road and get their thoughts on that.
Thank you. Do other managers have questions here?
I just got a comment. There is never, and I suppose it's for Steve's benefit, there's never any questions that the staff won't say, that's a good question. So you don't be afraid of asking any questions because the staff will always say it's a good question.
Just what we say when we don't know the answer.
One of our rules.
It's written into every job description.
Madam President, if there are
Yes,
no
Mr.
other managers, would I be able to offer a comment and a question?
Go for it.
Okay. I want to just echo that this work from my vantage point is powerful leading edge work. It's far ahead of what I believe other watershed districts are up to. And the level of sophistication with the data analytics and engagement is really impressive. I have two other kinds of thoughts alongside that. One, I think, is a communications strategy message. To me, to focus and say that our lane is only adaptation does present, to me, it's a fundamentally sad message. That there's not a role to do anything about climate change other than adapt to it. And I don't think that's exactly the district's message, but I think, in fact, we're not in the transportation business, we're not in the energy business, so that's why a big part of what mitigation is not our work. But carbon management and soil health is always been a big part of our mission, and I think it could continue to be. The 6 Mile Marsh project is a dramatic carbon story. And I think there will be more and more invitations and occasions, perhaps in our regulatory program, where we look at landscape changes and just with the added lens of soil health and carbon management, we're in a position to be doing things that are not getting in other people's lanes, well within our expertise, but also have something to do with mitigation. So I just offer that from a lay perspective. It's just one other comment.
Yeah, thank you, Louis. We heard similar feedback from one of the CAC members last week, so I think that is an interesting area that we'll want to explore a little further. And like you said, and also just make sure we're clearly explaining why some of those other things are outside of our scope and are kind of being done by other people, so that it doesn't seem like we're kind of remiss in not covering that.
I'm a little confused, Madam President.
Yes.
I'm a little confused by your comments, Louis. I just don't know what that means. Soils and that. We don't have any land use authority. Can you give an example? What would be an ideal project for us to take on with good partners?
Well, sure, Madam President, Manager Miller.
Yes.
I think the 6 Mile Marsh project is a pretty dramatic example. I don't know how many of those are in the pipeline. I think at 325 Blake Road, there is an ability to incorporate soil health into what has happened on the landscape at that site. And I think that in any other development that's occurring, the question of soil compaction and otherwise managing carbon relates to watershed management. Now, I'm getting a little bit out of my head of my skis because I'm not the scientist, but I do think that there is a big climate aspect to carbon management as it relates to soil. And there is a big aspect of soil is very relevant to sound watershed management from what I understand.
Every
Louis?
time a ground is turned over, if you plow, you're releasing carbon, for example.
I think what Lewis was saying earlier, though, was we should not just send out that depressing message of you know, we're going to face the storm and tough it out. But the idea that we're going to face the storm and tough it out, and these projects that we're working on are helping to reduce the carbon, so that there is a positive message that is incorporates everything. In other words, yes, we are adapting to climate change, but we're also doing what we can to mitigate that and to minimize it and to help it in the future. So it's two messages. One, we're going to help keep you from getting a wet basement, and two, we're going to do our part to make those weather threats go away. And that becomes, instead of a depressing message, it becomes sort of like two positive messages because they're integral to each other.
Let that discussion thread play out, but I wanted to weigh in on it too. So see if Dick had any follow-up on that.
Well, I don't know enough about it. It's you know, electric cars and windmills and all that kind of stuff. I understand that business, solar stuff, and but the soils I don't understand, and you know, I want to make sure that our message doesn't get all clouded up like we're gooey about the environment, and we just want to make sure we feel good about it. And I'm sure there's more science to back up Lewis's support for soils, but you know, it's something I'm totally unfamiliar with, and I'm not uncomfortable talking about it. So it'd really be helpful if we if Lewis is concerned about it, I am. Let's put it that way. But I need a lot more information to support it.
Right. Well, I'm interested to weigh in on that and the board discussion threads, but I also don't want to stifle things. One question I had is, and it's just reflects on an observation I have, is we've been working on this in the background for quite a while with the Citizens Advisory Committee in parallel paths. We've been working on building out this technology infrastructure so that we're able to understand how climate is going to drive in really big ways changes to our watershed's hydrology, because we know, you know, that's a big threat. It's also a big opportunity. People are going to look to the district for answers to some difficult questions. And so the board recognized that. We've been building out the technology. We've then embarked on this policy planning to develop this framework, which is wrapped around that technology work. About a year's worth of discussions and work. And I'm wondering if without us doing more work on the climate adaptation framework, because we're going to go work on communications and everything, if you'd like us to come back and facilitate more of a discussion, because today was a very large briefing. There's a lot of content. I'm hearing some really good questions that I think we have answers to and could have a really rich dialogue around before forging ahead with the next phase of work. So that was one question, is test the board's appetite to actually, now that you've had the briefing, let this sit with you, the questions that you've heard from your colleagues, reading the material, see if there'd be any interest in unpacking some of these questions in a bit more detail at a subsequent meeting. Without staff having to do any more work, I think we could have a pretty good conversation just amongst the board. And then I had reflections on Dick's question of Lewis and Manager Olson's response, which are all great thoughts.
I would be interested in that. Are other managers thinking that would be a good thing to have a little more discussion.
Yeah, the more I can learn on it, the better off I'm gonna be, so I'm fine.
Well, we'll think about that.
This is Arun. I want to make a comment, in response to that. Sorry, I'm just thinking a little slowly here. Apologize. The two things I think about that would be useful for me as a manager to evaluate this. One is the technical side of it. That is, some of the things that we've talked about, impact of soils, impact of other things, and what the data that we're producing, what does it mean? What implications does it have? And so on. That's one side of it. The second side of it is part of a bigger picture, which is the kind of messaging we do. That is, do we only look at adaptation versus mitigation? Who do we connect with? Sort of the biggest sphere in which this exists, and what we do with it, how we partner with other agencies. And so there is one is the technical area, and the other is the area of communication, working with other agencies, not duplicating things, and so on. So I would be interested in getting information about both sides of those, and some strategic thinking on both sides.
That's helpful, Manager Hejmati, because I think we've done quite a lot of work in both of those areas, as you can tell, and we've
Yes, you
developed
have.
a pretty
You certainly
good
have.
scan of governance, and we're not unpacking that fully here tonight. We did that with the Citizens Advisory Committee, and I've heard you say a couple times, and other managers reinforce, understanding our role in context of other agency roles, or likely other agency roles, and sort of mapping our role in creating that governance map. And I think we could have, that's something that we're prepared to facilitate a discussion on, and it leads through the conversation of ensuring we're not duplicating or having too much overlap. We want strategic points of connection, but we don't want to duplicate effort. And I think the governance conversation would be a good way to talk about both of those things.
Okay.
And the technical piece, of course, we can talk about the value that we're delivering and what this means, what these tools are going to mean in practice for when we work with communities. So I think that's helpful. I'm going to pause and see if there's other questions. I still have wanted to loop back on Manager Olson's response to Lewis's comment and Dick's question. And then I had another thought that came from the CAC that I wanted to push out that we haven't talked about tonight, I think could be instructive.
Anything else before James proceeds? Go ahead then, James.
Well, I think in its simplest terms, what Lewis was trying to say is with some of our lake management and some of our wetland management, water body restoration sequesters carbon. It pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and it gets it into the ground. So, there's emerging science around soil health and other things, and there's a variety of different ways to talk about it. But every time we restore a wetland, expand a wetland, and plant trees, we're sequestering carbon. We're not putting that lens or that metric to our work right now. And so even the work that we're doing right now, we could be talking about in that climate context of it is having mitigating effects. And so I think it's what I heard Lewis say was sort of two-pronged is, it's sort of an existentially sad message if you say, well, we're throwing our hands up and it's going to keep raining a lot, so let's get to the business of adaptation. We probably want a nice complement to that just on a communications basis. But at a deeper level, the work that we're doing is providing mitigation. It might not be as direct line as controlling at the source and changing energy supply from fossil fuels to renewables, and dealing with emissions. But the work that we're doing does have a mitigating effect, and there's enough modeling out there that you can quantify the amount of carbon that we're sequestering with projects like the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie, where we converted a tilled row crop 200-acre farm into deep-rooted prairie and with wetland basins. That's a carbon sink in the middle of Minnetrista that we invested substantial money. So we should talk about it in those terms, just like we talk about it as a connection to Dakota Regional or recreational asset, preservation of the historical barn, the scenic overlook, and treating water quality into Halstead Bay. It's another one of the planning lenses that we can bring to our work. And we shouldn't lose that through the policy planning that we're developing and just say that we're focusing on adaptation. So that's how I was understanding what Lewis was saying. And I'll just pause there to see if there's any reflections on that. And obviously I wasn't trying to put words in your mouth, Lewis, either.
That was helpful. That's what I was trying to say.
James, this is Chris. I would say technically you were correct in your analysis there. So I'll give you the technical background on that one too.
And so I think one of the questions, if we are doing mitigation, then one of the questions that Dick was asking is like, and these are things to unpack later, is how do we not get gooey, I think he said, and in our message, not diffusing our message, because there are a lot of folks out there, we're doing all this mitigation and we're doing adaptation. And when I've looked closer, a lot of times people are simply putting a climate adaptation lens to work they're already doing. Practices might not have changed that much, but they're talking about their capital projects in terms of mitigation and adaptation. I think to Manager Miller's point, we want to make sure that we're talking about the things that are a point of distinction, and how I think we're creating a markedly different approach, I think, from the governance scan that we've done and how I've looked around. I heard Lewis say that in his experience watching other watersheds. So we can talk about mitigation, that's legitimate, authentic, there's a technical base for it. On balance, I think what I heard Manager Miller say is making sure that we're not diluting our principal message of how we're going to help communities adapt. And I think that there's a lot there in terms of communications, because the way that we've been thinking about climate is, and how it's related to us and how it's acting on us in our lane, is that it is going to change hydrology, and that is our principal business. That is the only reason we exist. And if it's changing our hydrology in ways that are going to impact the natural systems, but also create significant impact in the built environment, this is going to tax infrastructure, and it's going to tax private property and create significant impact and potentially displace land uses. That's actually an opportunity, because we'll get invited into the land use game even more than we are now by communities and land use developers that want answers to really difficult questions. So positioning ourselves as adaptation experts long-term strategically, I think, is a key to the next door in this level that we're climbing of being invited willingly and embraced by land use community, where we can play with the land use levers to achieve our mission of water quality management. So I think, going back to what I just said, we are doing mitigation, we can metric it, measure it, talk about it. On balance, I think one of the reasons we've gravitated towards a lot of focus on adaptation is just the obvious. It's going to fundamentally change how water moves through our 178 square miles. And when that impacts communities, that's a massive strategic threat / opportunity, because communities are going to demand answers, and they're going to go to one place. And we've seen that play out in the last 3 years with Zumbra, Nokomis, Hiawatha, on smaller scales, Shorewood, Morningside. And what communities are going to ask is they're going to ask questions that nobody else can answer. What happens if I pump this landlocked basin into the creek? At a local scale, you might not impact flood stage, but if 10 communities do that to 10 basins, what's the net effect? We need answers. We need to be able to answer those questions in order to create a cohesive water budget at a strategic level. And so one thing that the CAC's encouraged us to do is, I think this was John Soldit's geometric metaphor that he keeps using, is what are the 4 corners of your box that you're going to operate in? I heard Manager Loftus say, what's your lane? And we're talking about mitigation and adaptation. And I think we have some good answers to that. One way to think about that is how what we talked about tonight and how climate adaptation is going to impact our existing lines of business. What does it mean for research and monitoring? What does it mean for our principal strategy of developing policy at the land use water nexus? What does it mean for how we build capital projects? And what does it mean for how we operate and maintain all the infrastructure we already own? I think in answering those questions, you can carve out your box, and it's very clear the work that we're going to be doing is squarely in our lane. It'll be valuable to communities, and in fact, they're going to demand that we do that work, and that's why we're sort of well on our way with preparations that Brian's outlined and the board has endorsed. So those are a couple of thoughts. Hopefully those weren't too rambling, since it's pushing 9 o'clock, and I know folks are tired and maybe not speaking entirely clearly. And I think I'll turn it back to the board to see if there's any other comments that jarred loose or feedback. And then we've gotten some wonderful feedback tonight that I think we can digest and then consider bringing back to the board for another more focused discussion rather than briefing, now that we've gotten a lot of information unpacked. So that's something that we could do as a next step.
Background, we had a retreat, a board retreat, not quite 2 years ago, and the sole topic was climate. So the board was clearly ready to move in that direction, and now staff are getting us closer to where we need to be. Staff and board, I don't want to say they're doing it all. Any other thoughts before we move on?
James, thanks for your interpretation of what we're trying to say. I think you always add clarity and summarize us and make us sound better than we originally did. So thank you. Like what you said and where you think we should head with it, and discussing it a second time. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm hearing a lot of similarities between the things that staff have discussed and the challenges, what we've heard from CAC and the board. And that's part of the process, is everybody is trying to, deal with these concepts in their own terms and using their own language. And I think we are at a junction point right now, we've talked about with Brian and Becky, where we need to take a moment and unpack all that and make sure that we're all talking and thinking about this in the same way before we take the next step. Because then we'll have a clear path forward. So I do think it'd be worth having staff think about second or third round conversation. It's just a discussion where you can ask questions and we can unpack the work in a little bit more detail. I think that would be helpful for everybody.
Sounds good. If we're ready to move on, James, we're ready for the administrator's report then. Thank
Very
you,
good.
Brian and Becky. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Well, President White managers, unfortunately, I wanted to start the top of the administrator's report by sharing some sad news that a former board member that some of you know, manager Pam Blixt, lost her battle with leukemia. We heard on March 1st. Pam, for those of you who don't know, served on the Watershed District Board for over 20 years, including in the role of board president. And she also, I think, was one of the original members all the way through until she passed on the Clean Water Council. And Pam had a deep passion for water and natural resources. And I wanted to pass that note along to the board. And I will work with President White to determine how we can extend our organizational sympathies to Pam's family. On some other business-related updates, Laura wanted me to pass along that construction started on Monday, March 8th for the Auburn Lake Art Barrier. You'll recall that's within the Carver Park Reserve. The in-water work for that barrier is expected to be finished by the weekend, and final completion is expected early to mid next week. Give you a little bit of an update on 325 Blake Road planning. As you know, in February, we began the listening sessions, and we've conducted those with our board so far, staff and advisors. So our landscape architects, Lewis Smith, our financial advisors and others. We've completed one with Hopkins City staff, and we have an upcoming listening session scheduled with the Hopkins City Council for Tuesday, March 16th. So that's next Tuesday. And then the broader community, to the public, on March 31st. And so we'll be presenting at City Council and conducting that listening session next Tuesday, and then we'll have feedback for you before we go back out to the broader community. We'll be able to give you another update through the administrator's report on March 25th. The project website's being updated with a video talking about the project and a survey in the lead up to the community session. It's just another way to concisely communicate what we're trying to accomplish, as well as collect information from the community and our partners. We've met with select developers from the letter of interest process, and conducted the informal roundtable meetings, and we did those on March 9th. The request for proposals for the shortlisted set of developers is scheduled to be released next week. And staff and HDR have started to work on developing the criteria with which we're going to be reviewing the proposals once they're submitted. So it's a little bit of a feed on 325 Blake Road, and feel free to reach out to myself, Mike Heyman, if you've got questions offline, you want to catch up and talk about that project in more detail. Obviously, it's significant. We want to keep the information flowing. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is water levels. Spring's here, snow is melting or has melted, and that means water's moving, and it's time to resume water level updates. And I have a couple of quick updates that you may have received by email. Just in terms of the spring melt, thus far has resulted in about 45 inches of snow from 2020 to 2021. That's around average or normal. Most of the snowpacks melted, according to NOAA. And the Lake Minnetonka, as you know, has maintained a level just below 928.7. It's or 928.6 since the dam was winterized in December 2020. We had a dry fall heading into the snow season. We've gone out and resurveyed the lake level and looked at the USGS gauge. We're sitting right around 928.61, and that means the dam's going to remain closed for a while until the ice melts. I think the current plan is to not proactively de-ice through aeration like we have in the past, just given the minimal risk of flooding and the level that the lake is currently at, and we'll keep you informed if that changes. Moving downstream into the creek's flowing in most areas freely, in some areas over ice. The watershed and the park board have been monitoring down in Minneapolis and continue to scan problem areas. And as you know, Tiffany's put out a request to other cities to just be on the lookout, conduct inspections, and provide alerts. And then at the Nokomis area, the park board closed the weir last week. That remained open all winter, and that's to prevent spring flows from the creek entering the lake. And right now, Lake Nokomis's water level is below the weir runout elevation. So that means water would not be able to leave the lake even if the dam were open. So the lake's been drawn down over the winter. And with the precipitation forecast, it looks pretty dry for the next couple of weeks. We're getting about a half to an inch of rain over Tuesday, Wednesday, and then the 30 or 90-day forecasts are sort of 50-50 on above or below normal precipitation. So you could probably take bets amongst yourselves, but there isn't a strong indicator that we're getting a ton of rain or a drought right now, so we'll have to wait and see. With that, I will take any questions that you have, President White or managers.
Questions? I guess we're filled in. Well, our business is complete and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yes.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah.
Stay
Good
positive,
good night,
Jeff.
Happy
everyone.
St. Patrick's Day, Gene. Have a
Yes,
wonderful
you're welcome.
evening.
Aaron,
you
go
will.
bra.
Steve,
Thank you.
congratulations on making it through your first meeting. You're muted right now, sir. So you have to unmute. Steve, I can see you talking, but you're on mute. We cannot hear you. So you have to hit the mute button.
Just yell louder.
Yeah, it doesn't work. I wish. There you
There
go.
it goes.
There you go. We
Okay,
can hear
I
you.
just want to just comment that I'm very excited to be on the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District Board. Very impressed with all the board members, the staff, and just excited to help contribute and work with all of you.
Glad to have you.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Same. Welcome, Mr. Sando. Happy to have you. Excited to work
Thank
with
you
you.
very much. Take care, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.